Hello students, as promised, here is the brief presentation on Chapter 1, The Changing Boundaries of Criminology, which everyone should have already read by now. As your syllabus indicates, there was initially supposed to be a discussion question that would have been due for week number 2 for this chapter, but because we got off to a late start and with the additional delays that we encountered as a result of the hurricane, I did indicate that the discussion question for week 2 was eliminated, and in lieu of that, I was going to provide a brief presentation of topics that I felt were important and were key points to narrow in on from Chapter 1. Now, this doesn't mean that you can use this presentation as a substitute for reading Chapter 1. You still have to read the entire chapter, but this is just a presentation on information that I think was important from Chapter 1. So let's begin. The topics that we will be discussing during this presentation are terrorism, crime versus deviance, the concept of crime, the breaking of laws, and economic and social conditions. Now, I wanted to begin with providing you with the textbook definition of criminology. This definition was taken directly from your text, and I've included it in this presentation because I think that it is important for you to know what criminology is and what it means in order for you to get a better understanding of the nature of this course and to be able to relate more easily to the information that will be provided to you in this course. So word for word from your textbook, criminology is the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon. It includes within its scope the process of making laws, breaking laws, and reacting toward the breaking of laws. Thus, criminology is an empirical, social, behavioral science that investigates crime, criminals, and criminal justice. Now, the first topic that we will be discussing in this presentation is terrorism, and the book spends a great deal of time talking about terrorism. I'm not going to focus that deeply on this topic because, like I said, you all should have read Chapter 1 by now, and whatever information on terrorism that's missing from this presentation, you should have already gotten from reading the textbook. But I did want to highlight, however, the fact that the author chose to include two definitions for terrorism. The first definition comes from the U.S. Code, Title 22 of the U.S. Code, Section 2656FD. Now keep in mind the F and the D in this code section are lowercase, so if you try to look this up in the U.S. Code on your own, look for the subsection with the small f and the small d. Of course, it's only capitalized here because the way this text is set up, everything is in capital letters, so I just thought I would point that out. But the U.S. Code defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. Now, the textbook authors, they created their own definition: the use or threat of violence directed at people or governments in response to past action and or to bring about a change of policy that is consistent with terrorists' objectives. Now, essentially, these definitions mean the same thing. They're just slightly different. There's some different wording some different words added and subtracted here and there, but in essence they both mean the same thing. I just thought it was interesting that the author chose to create his or her own definition as opposed to just going with the one that's already been provided for us in the federal code. Now, at the bottom of this slide, you can see I included a link there that shows a list of all the terrorist attacks that have occurred in the United States from the very beginning of time. There are quite a few of them. I don't expect you all to memorize them all or memorize any of them for that matter, but I just thought that it would be interesting and informative for you to be able to see in a list format all the terrorist attacks that have occurred in the United States to date. Another thing that the author focused on was how these terrorist organizations are able to finance their acts of terrorism. They came up with 7 ways that they're able to finance their acts of terrorism. And if you pay close attention here, you'll see that these 7 methods are separate crimes in and of themselves. These are all crimes here from 1 to 7 that the author listed as ways that these terrorist organizations are able to finance their acts of terrorism. This image here to the right comes directly from your book, so if any of the wording is unclear in the presentation, you can just look at figure 1.1 in your book and you'll be able to get a more clear view of the wording and whatnot. But if you look here, you can see that the center of this thing is terrorism. That is the very center of the wheel. And then the 7 spokes, as the author calls them, are the separate crimes that are directly linked in this instance to terrorism, and they are illicit drug trafficking, money laundering, infiltration of legal businesses, computer crime, illicit arms trafficking, trafficking in persons, and theft, destruction, cultural. Now, the book goes into great detail as to what each one of these things are and what they represent, so I didn't bother to do that in the presentation, but I would like you to, however, go over these things again, understand them, know what they are, and be able to explain what effect they have on our economy. Now, I've just went over those seven individual crimes that are linked to the act of terrorism, and I provided you with the link of the numerous terrorist attacks that have occurred in the United States, but there isn't that much mention of any acts of terrorism that occur in St. Thomas, so I took this opportunity to be able to bring an instance to light and to bring this to your attention, because I think that it's a great way to get the wheels in your heads turning and give you an opportunity to use the definitions of terrorism that were just provided to you to determine whether or not the act that took place right here in St. Thomas back in the summer of 2018, last year, whether or not that was in fact an act of terrorism. Now, based on the way the defendant was charged in this article that you will read, it appears as though what he did was not considered an act of terrorism, because we do have some terrorism charges here in the Virgin Islands. They would be under Title 14 of the Virgin Islands Code, and he wasn't charged with any of those things. In fact, he was charged with conversion of government property, malicious mischief, and petty larceny. So, while it's already been determined that what he did was not in fact an act of terrorism, I would like you to just read this article and formulate on your own opinion as to whether or not this was an act of terrorism. And if you do agree with the Department of Justice that this was not an act of terrorism, I want you to be able to articulate what elements were missing from his act that caused the authorities to determine that his actions did not rise to the level of terrorism. Now, this isn't an assignment or anything that's going to be due. I just need you to be able to articulate this on your own in the event this question should appear on an exam. The next topic that we are going to discuss here is crime versus deviance. And here I have this lovely photograph of what appears to be a grocery cart that is loaded with tons and tons of groceries. The book mentioned a grocery store hypothetical that I'll briefly go over with you in its explanation of crime versus deviance. So let's say typical grocery store, you know, you have the express line that clearly says 15 items or less. You're in this line because you have in your possession 15 items or less. But then you discover that the person in front of you has about 45 items and he is in this express line that clearly says 15 items or less. So the question then becomes, is this a crime or is this deviance? Now, your book defines this very clearly. Deviance is a broad concept of encompassing both illegal behavior that departs from the social norm. For example, going to the 15 item only express line at the grocery store with 50 items. The social norms that this thing is referring to are perceived standards of acceptable behavior prevalent among members of society. So social norms are just things that we conform to. They aren't any type of formal laws or anything, but they're just things that we conform to, that we all do as members of society, like only going into that express line if we have 15 items or less. Crime, however, is different from deviance because it is the violation of an actual criminal law. For example, stealing someone's property. So you can look all this over in your textbook, but I just want you to be able to articulate the difference between crime and deviance and how social norms apply to this discussion. Some things to think about for the crime versus deviance aspect of the discussion. Making something that is distasteful into a crime may be counterproductive and detrimental to the social order. This is true, but I would like you all to be able to explain how that is true. And then if everything deviant were to be made criminal, society would become very rigid. Again, this is true, but what exactly is meant by this statement? Now, like I said before, there's no discussion questions that's due on this topic, but I just want you to consider these things and be able to articulate them. So examples of this would be, you know, loud music, for example. We know that if you live in a residential area, you should not be playing your music at unreasonably loud volumes, okay? That would once have been considered a deviant act, not necessarily a crime, but a violation of a social norm. Now I believe there are some laws or some ordinances put in place where if you violate that, you're violating a noise ordinance of some sort and you'll have to pay a fine or something like that. And then the other example that I have here are the doggy sidewalks. You know, the people who walk their dog on the sidewalks and the dogs use the bathroom on the sidewalks and they don't clean up after the dog. So then this leaves messy sidewalks for members of the community who don't like that. Again, that is not so much a crime, but a violation of a social norm, so it would be considered deviant conduct.